Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. You're standing at the entrance of a Viking longhouse, not a king's hall, not a myth-wrapped fortress of sagas and feasts. Just a regular longhouse, thick-timbered, turf-roofed, half buried in the earth to keep out wind and snow. The doorway is low enough that even the tallest warrior must bow to enter. And tonight, you've been invited for dinner. But before you step in, you should know this: where you sit and how you hold your spoon. This will quietly reveal everything about who you are and who you'll never be. Inside, the longhouse breathes. It doesn't feel like a house in the modern sense. It feels like a stomach. The smell of boiled fish and wood smoke clings to every beam. The thatch above you is dripping with condensation. The fire crackles not in a hearth, but in a long, open trench down the center, wide enough to stew meat and dry boots at the same time. There are no windows, only the red glow light from the central flames, and faint shafts of sun slipping through. The smoke hole above and benches, 2 long wooden benches, one down each side, parallel, facing each other like mirrors of status. This is where the rules begin. In a Viking longhouse, you don't just eat dinner, you perform it, and you're not the only one. Everyone here, from the head of the household to the slave crouching near the fire, plays a role in a deeply layered social ritual, one that historians are still decoding. Piece by piece, from fragments of sagas, household laws, and the wear patterns on bowls found in the soil. The first rule: position is power. There is no menu, no written plan. But everyone knows who eats first, who eats last, and who shouldn't speak unless spoken to. If you're important, maybe the eldest son or a visiting merchant will sit at the inner end of the bench, closest to the fire pit and the head of the table. Your legs will stretch into the warmest part of the room. If you're young, new to the household, or of lower rank, you'll sit at the outer ends, farther from the hearth, where the draft slips in and the soup is always just a little cooler. But it's not just about heat, it's about proximity to decisions. The closer you are to the central bowl, the louder your voice becomes in the longhouse sabin if you never speak. The second rule: don't move your spoon. This sounds absurd at first, but the placement of your eating tools, usually a simple wooden spoon and maybe a knife, serves as a quiet signal of behavior and obedience. Place your spoon to the left of your bowl. Signals you're done. Place it on top of your bowl. You're waiting for more. Leave it inside the bowl after the meal. That's a breach of etiquette. The T suggests impatience, or worse, entitlement, according to the Icelandic GRG's law codes and various later medieval accounts. Utensils were one of the few things in a longhouse that had fixed rules. You might sleep anywhere, help with anything, carry loads, or clean wounds. But the placement of your spoon was always intentional, because spoons had to be carved by hand, often given as gifts or made by someone else in the household. They weren't just tools. They were tokens of belonging. To leave yours in the bowl like it was disposable was to disrespect the very home that fed you. The third rule: never sit before the host does. This was not a Viking quirk. Across early medieval Europe, the ritual of the seated meal was part of domestic choreography. But in the Norse context, especially in Icelandic and rural Norwegian, longhouses, this rule was sacred. The master or mistress of the longhouse would always enter last. Then observe the bench. They were watching, not for fun, but for claims. Seating wasn't just about comfort. It was about rights, to land, to labor, to food. If you sat too close to the head of the table without permission, you were quietly implying that you were equal or worse, superior. In some households, It was custom to let a guest approach the high seat as a mark of welcome, but not without being asked. To sit without invitation was, in the softest words of a 13th century Norwegian proverb, as shameful as bringing your own ale to another man's hearth. Here's a small detail you might overlook. There were no chairs. Not in the modern sense. Chairs were rare, expensive, mostly reserved for chieftains or kings. Everyone else sat on low benches or sheepskin-covered trunks. And this, too, meant something. Without backrests or arms, you had to be present, upright, balanced. You had to mind your posture, 'cause to slump was to show disrespect both to the food and the people around you. And if you couldn't sit straight through an entire meal, you were probably too drunk, too weak, or too ignorant to be trusted with work the next day. Even comfort in the longhouse was a kind of test. Let's talk about food now. Not what was cooked, we'll get to that later, but how it was served. Communal bowls. This is essential. Dishes were rarely individualized. Stews, fish, gruel, or boiled greens were placed in large wooden or stoneware bowls that sat in the center of the table. Everyone reached toward the same center, and this made seating matter. It's even more because the closer you were, the more you got while it was hot. But it also revealed something else. Who got meat in many households? Small cuts of meat, specially preserved or smoked portions, were placed on top of the communal bowl, so they could be portioned according to status. If a guest saw a piece of fatty pork placed near their side of the bowl, it was a gesture of welcome. If you got none, it wasn't a mistake. It meant you hadn't earned it yet. Now, let's pause for a moment and listen. The longhouse isn't silent. A bowl, just fire, crackle, bowl scrape, occasional breath. This wasn't accidental. Norse etiquette discouraged loud eating. Not because it was rude in the modern sense, but because noise disrupted the order of the room. Every sound had a place. The crack of bones from a soup pot, acceptable. The thud of a dropped spoon, embarrassing. The cough of someone who spoke out of turn, a signal, a warning, a moment when the air grew heavier. A Viking feast could be rowdy, but an ordinary household dinner followed a rhythm. And if you broke it by standing too soon, speaking too loud, sitting too near, you weren't just impolite. You were a threat to the longhouse's internal balance. Perhaps the most curious rule: you had to help with nothing. That is, less you'd been asked in a typical modern dinner. Offering to help clean or serve is seen as kind, generous, but in the Viking longhouse, unsolicited help was a violation. It suggested the host couldn't manage their home. It implied you thought the meal or the people were beneath you. Tasks were delegated, clearly, often by the lady of the house. And if you stood up during dinner to adjust a pot or reposition a bowl without being told, you might not be invited back. But here's the quiet thread that runs through it all. Observation was everything. Gay new servant, a newly married son-in-law, a neighbor's cousin come to visit. These weren't just names. They were watchers, and watched. Every dinner in the Viking longhouse was a test of belonging. Who noticed the timing of the soup? Who passed the bread clockwise, not counterclockwise? Who wiped their spoon before placing it on the bench? These details didn't make you noble, but they proved you were paying attention. And in a world where survival depended on community, attention was everything. Now the meal is ending. You've eaten your stew. You've set your spoon properly. You haven't spoken out of turn, but the final test is still ahead. You must not leave before the host stands, not fully, not even to stretch. You remain seated, spine upright, hands on knees, eyes lowered, not in submission, but in awareness. You wait, and when the host finally pushes back from the bench, you follow. Not immediately, but one heartbeat later. Too soon, and you seem impatient. Too late, and you seem unaware. And in that pause between the master's rise and your own lies the thin thread of judgment that weaves through every night in the Viking Longhouse. King Longhouse. You stayed seated, as instructed by centuries of silent rules. But what comes after that small act of patience, the moment when the host finally says more about Viking life than the food itself? Because dinner in a Viking Longhouse didn't end with the last bite of barley stew. It ended with acknowledgement, a glance, a word, a silence held just long enough to mean, you belong here. And for many, especially those newly welcomed into the household, that subtle permission meant more than a full bowl ever could. To understand how deeply this seated ritual shaped Viking domestic life, you must go beyond the food and into the framework beneath it. The Viking Longhouse was never just a dining space. It was a stage for relationships. Every corner of it was soaked in hierarchy, memory, and obligation. Imagine this, a boy of 12, just old enough to be trusted with errands, to the buyer, sits halfway down the bench tonight, not at the end, not near the head, just halfway and in the world of that longhouse. This is a promotion. He doesn't say anything, but his mother notices. His uncle nods at him with a barely visible grin. Someone passes him a ladle before he asks. All of this because of where he sat. Because that place on the bench didn't just reflect social standing. It shaped expectations. You didn't move up by asking. You moved up by absorbing, by learning the rhythm of the meal, pace, the conversation, the unspoken indicators of readiness and trust. In a world without written manuals or employee handbooks, the bench was the curriculum, and still no one talked about it out loud because Norse culture prized action over explanation. The sagas, full of feasts and rivalries, rarely describe why someone sat where they did, but they show you between the lines that the act of sitting was never random, like in the saga of Hrafnkel. When a man of middling status sits too close to the chieftain and sparks quiet outrage, or in Egil Saga, when a clever skald uses his words to earn a seat among the honored, reshaping his fortune by reciting at the table. Over and over, the message repeats itself. Know your place, okay, and know how to earn another. So what happened once the meal ended? After the bowls were cleared and the breadcrumbs swept with a goat hair brush, this is where we encounter another odd rule, one that rarely appears in modern imaginations of Viking life. You didn't leave immediately. Dinner was a transition, not a finale, and what followed was something like informal judgment. The host would remain standing near the central fire, often with a cup of ale or mead, and observe how the room resettled, who lingered too long, who cleaned without being asked, who slipped away without speaking. These post-meal behaviors carried just as much weight as the seated ones because they revealed how someone viewed the household's rhythm, and to ignore that rhythm was a signal of disinterest, or even disrespect. Let's return to the boy, seated halfway down the bench. He's finished his stew, wiped his spoon, and quietly waited for the host to rise. But now he picks up his bowl, walks it to the edge of the hearth, and places it near the woman who's beginning to gather the serving tools. She doesn't thank him. He doesn't ask. She needs help. They don't speak, but the gesture is seen by 3 people, maybe 4, and it'll be remembered the next time. The benches are set in this way. The spoon was only the beginning. The rules of the longhouse weren't written, but they were passed visually, bodily, through posture and pauses, rather than words. Now, let's shift the lens just slightly. Let's talk about exceptions. What happened when the rules were deliberately broken? Because sometimes they were, and these moments mattered just as much. For instance, the guest was of such high importance, a traveling merchant with news from the south, or a returning son who had just proven himself in a raid they might be offered the host's seat. This was rare. unheard of in many households, but when it happened, it was deeply symbolic. The offer would not be made in words, but with a hand gesture or a nod, okay? And the guest, knowing the weight of the moment, might politely decline or accept with quiet humility. And everyone would watch, because in that instant, power shifted, not permanently, but symbolically. And in a society where wealth was mobile, land was shareable, okay? And glory could come from sea or soil. Such shifts were meaningful. They told the room, this person's presence is worth reshaping the rhythm of the house. Now, back to ordinary days, because most dinners were exactly that, ordinary. Grains and fish, left over, root vegetables in a simple broth, salt herring, occasionally sky-fermented milk curds, if luck allowed. The meals weren't elaborate, they weren't loud, but the structure around them was thick with meaning. And for those who lived in the longhouse every day, who woke, worked, ate, and slept in that single, breathing, structured dinner ritual, was how you learned who was stable, who was rising, and who was fading. If someone began to sit closer to the hearth, day by day, others noticed. If someone was gradually moved farther away, even if nothing was said, that was noticed too. It was all part of a language without sound. One small story from archaeological finds might illustrate the point. At a site in Borg, Norway, where a remarkably preserved longhouse was excavated in the 1980s, researchers found were patterns on the wooden benches that lined the central fire trench. The inner ends, nearest the head table, were worn more deeply than the outer ends, not just from weight, but from frequency of use. People sat there more, rose and returned more, shifted and leaned more. It suggests what sagas only imply, that the high-status seats weren't just symbolic. They were busy. The people who held those seats weren't merely honored. They were active in decisions, in hosting, in managing the rhythm of the room. And so the spoon, the seat, the silent gaze after supper, all of it combined into a map of social flow, not just hierarchy, but mobility. One final rule for this section, perhaps the quietest one: you never ask for a seat, not with words, not even with a glance. To ask was to claim, and to claim without proof was to risk being seen as presumptuous or worse, as a threat. Instead, you waited, you observed, you let the seat be offered, or you adjusted subtly over time until your presence was simply accepted closer to the center. And in this waiting, in this soft descent through silence and service, lay one of the greatest truths of Viking domestic life: that honor was rarely seized. It was more often allowed. The boy at the bench has moved his bowl. The guest near the hearth finishes his ale and leans slightly toward the fire, not to dominate the room, but to warm his hands. The host walks slowly toward the sleeping area, and others begin to rise. Not all at once, not in a rush, but like waves, leaving the shore behind. The meal is over. But the rules have only deepened, because in this world, it's how you eat says nothing, but how you behave while eating says everything, everything. Now, you might be wondering, why did they let all this happen without ever writing it down? Why would a culture so invested in status, obligation, and reputation not leave behind a tidy list of dinner-time rules? The answer is simple: because if you had to ask, you didn't belong in a Viking longhouse. Social fluency wasn't about memorizing customs, it was about absorbing them. If you couldn't feel when to rise, when to pass the bowl, when to pause before reaching for the ladle, then no amount of written etiquette would save you from the subtle shifting of benches that followed. The rules weren't for newcomers. They were for insiders, and you've earned your way into them slowly, bite by bite, silence by silence. So let's imagine the longhouse once more tonight, unusually quiet. Perhaps a guest has arrived from another fjord, or a minor dispute is lingering after the morning's labor. The food is the same as yesterday, smoked fish, a bit of broth, some dark bread, broken into rough pieces. But the mood is different. You notice it in the way people pass the bowls more quickly. No one is refilling their mug. The conversation stays soft, even as the fire crackles a little louder than usual. Then something happens. A young woman, recently taken in from another household, reaches for the salted butter before the host has touched it. She isn't corrected, but she notices the silence that follows. The next day, she waits. She lets the host dip his knife first. Nothing is said. But 3 meals later, she's sitting half a spot closer to the fire in Viking life. A single act of restraint could earn you a week's worth of trust. It might seem small, these meal-based negotiations, but they form the backbone of conflict. Avoidance in a world without written contracts. Feasting, hosting, sitting, serving, all of it functioned as relational cement in societies that had no police force. No centralized law beyond the Norse assembly, and no external authority dictating domestic structure. Everything depended on social memory. If a man passed the mead clockwise, served himself last, and cleaned up without being told, people remembered. And when it came time for favors, alliances, even marriage discussions, these details surfaced. Because mealtime was never just about nutrition, it was rehearsal. For war, for trade, for law. Let's shift to another layer of this longhouse rhythm. Storytelling. After the bowls were cleared and the fire stoked, one of the older men or women might begin a tale, not loudly, not with dramatic flair, but with a kind of soft gravity. And in this moment, new rules emerged. You didn't interrupt. You didn't fidget noisily. You didn't leave the bench unless the story was finished, or unless your role in the household made your absence forgivable. Even the way you responded to the story was layered with unspoken meanings. A chuckle too loud, disrespectful. No smile at all, suspicious. Every gesture was part of the dance, and this dance of the bench, quiet, crowded, smoky, half-lit, was how stories themselves were passed down. Not just in words, but in ritual form. Some say this is why the sagas survived so long, because they were shaped not only by speech, but by the setting in which they were spoken. But perhaps the strangest rule of Viking dinnertime wasn't about food or benches or mead. It was about memory. If someone had eaten with you before, and you failed to acknowledge them properly at the next meal, it was considered a grave social misstep, not always hostile, but deeply telling. It meant you either didn't value them, didn't remember them, and in Norse culture, were oral memory was history. That kind of forgetfulness was dangerous, so people remembered where you sat last time, who you passed the spoon to, whether you shared your dried berries or tucked them away. Your whole reputation could rise or fall on the retelling of how you behaved at supper. In this way, dinner became something else entirely, a kind of quiet surveillance. And yet, there was comfort in this too, for those who did follow the rhythm, for those who learned to read the firelight, to wait half a breath before pouring their drink, gesture instead of speak when passing food. This structure offered security. It said, if you can move through this world silently and correctly, you will be seen, even if you're poor, even if you're young, even if you came from another coast. You didn't need a title to earn respect. You needed rhythm, and you needed stillness. One final rule, perhaps the most oddly comforting. You didn't rush. No one clapped at the end of a meal. No one announced that it was over. People lingered. Sometimes they dozed, their backs against the timber posts. Sometimes they listened to the fire or watched it flatten into quiet coals. This silence, shared and unforced, was part of the meal itself. And if someone tried to stand too quickly or began sweeping while others were still holding their cups, the host might simply raise an eyebrow. No scolding, just a reminder. You are in a longhouse, not a barn, not a camp. not a tavern. And here, things end slowly. So, what do we take from this? What lesson lives inside a Viking longhouse in the dark quiet after supper when the spoons are laid flat and the stew has gone cold? Maybe it's this, that every civilization builds its rules somewhere, some in stone, some in scripture, some in law. But the Vikings, they built theirs in seating arrangements, in subtle pauses, in the soft clink of horn against wood. And these rules, though never written down, held their world together, held their households in harmony, held their guests in reverence, held their enemies in observation. Because where the spoon sat wasn't just about dinner, it was about who you were becoming. You're sitting in the same Viking longhouse, but tonight's something's different. There's an animal in the room. Not unusual, of course, but this one sits upright, close to the hearth, still, silent, watching. It's a large dog, likely a mix of hunting hound and guard breed. Its fur is patchy in places. A scar runs above one eye. This isn't a pet, not by modern standards. It's part of the house, and everyone treats it that way. No one moves until the dog does. No bowls are touched, no bites are taken. A wooden ladle hangs loosely from someone's hand. And then, finally, the dog shifts, lays down, licks its paw. Only then does the first spoon meet the bowl. You've just witnessed one of the strangest and most silent forms of mealtime. Timing in the Norse world. Animal signaling. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't sentimentality. It was pragmatic trust in the most alert being in the room. To understand this odd ritual waiting for the dog before you eat, we have to first step back into the broader framework of Viking TIMEKEEPING. Because clocks didn't exist, and neither did watches. Time was measured through rhythms of sunlight, tides, birdsong, hunger pangs, and yes, animal behavior in the northern latitudes, where longhouses were built to survive both harsh winters and endless summer days. Kind couldn't always be tracked by light. Sunset might last for hours. Daylight might vanish for days. So, instead, Viking households learned to read signs. The tilt of a shadow, the scent of boiling fish, the rustle of woolen tunics as people moved to their places, and sometimes the twitch of a dog's ear. The house dog, called Hunter in Old Norse, wasn't simply a guard or a hunter. It was a living alert system. Dogs, in many longhouses, occupied the space between domestic order and external danger. They guarded the door, but didn't sleep near it. They watched the hearth, but didn't interfere. They walked among the family, but answered only to one or two voices. And during meals, their behavior was watched closely. A dog lying down meant calm. It meant the world outside the longhouse, whether wild or human, was not currently threatening. A dog standing, pacing, or growling, that meant unease. You didn't eat during unease, because eating required lowering your guard. And in a world where raids, rivalries, and wolves were part of the landscape, even a mouthful of stew required timing. But this goes deeper than just safety. Dogs weren't just watched, they were often fed first. And this wasn't about generosity. It was about purity and sacrifice. In some Norse communities, especially in Western Scandinavia, household dogs were believed to possess a kind of ritual clarity. They could smell disease in meat, sense spoilage before the nose could, refuse food that had been tampered with. So, the dog's behavior became a test. A piece of meat dropped beside it. If the dog ate calmly, so could you. If the dog sniffed and walked away, the pot was often tossed. Not always, but often enough to matter. Because in a world without refrigeration, without thermometers, without any modern concept of contamination, the Viking household relied on the animal that lived closest to its scraps. Now, imagine how this worked in real time. A guest arrives. The stew is already cooking. Salt fish, onions, maybe a scrap of wild bird. The host greets the guest, offers a bowl, then pauses. The ladle hovers. Then a hand reaches down and places a tiny bit of fish on a flat stone near the hearth. The dog approaches, sniffs, and if all is well devours it in one gulp. Only then does the host ladle stew into the guest's bowl. Nothing is said aloud, but everything is understood. The dog has approved, and therefore, so has fate. Archaeological evidence for this kind of dog-centered ritual isn't always direct, but is present in burial sites like Oseberg in Norway and Firecat in Denmark. Dogs were buried with high-status women, not just as pets, but as companions of symbolic value. Some scholars argue that dogs in Norse households weren't just animals. They were threshold beings, entities that could move between domestic space and wild space, between humans and the gods, between this world and the next. So it made sense that they would also help regulate the ritual of eating an act that symbolized life, safety, and shared trust. And in many cases, they performed this task better than any person could, because a dog didn't lie, a dog didn't flatter. If something was wrong, spoiled, unsafe, or simply out of rhythm, the dog would react, and the people would follow, of course. Not every longhouse had a dog trained for this purpose. Some had cats, or none at all. But where dogs were present, their role in meals often followed one of three rhythms. The watcher, the dog, sat still by the fire. If it rose or growled, no food was eaten until calm returned. The taster, a small piece of food, was offered before serving began. The dog's reaction determined trust in the pot. The divider, leftover bones or scraps, were first given to the dog, not last. This was seen not as kindness, but as continuity, symbolic returning of the food to the animal world it came from. These rhythms varied from region to region, but the underlying principle remained. Eating wasn't individual. It was collective, and the dog, as nonverbal member of the household, was part of that collective. But there's another layer, still a darker one, because sometimes dog didn't eat first because of caution. It ate first because of fear. There are mentions, brief but chilling, in some Norse texts and folklore, of dogs being used to test for poison, not just spoiled meat, but deliberate harm. This was rare but intense gatherings, especially during feast days when guests from rival clans or unknown ships were present. The host might drop a bite on the floor as a signal, "We trust no one yet." And if the dog ate and lived, trust might follow. But if it didn't, well, that stew would never touch human lips, and someone would be quietly watched for the pits rest of the night. So when you hear that phrase, "You couldn't start eating until the dog did," you're hearing more than a folk custom. You're hearing a codified survival strategy. You're hearing centuries of experience distilled into a single motion. Watch the dog, then eat. And still, there was tenderness too. Some longhouses developed a custom of feeding the dog from a specific bowl, kept near the hearth. It wasn't painted or decorated, but it was always clean, sometimes carved with simple notches to mark years or litters. Children were often tasked with washing it, drying it, and setting it back into place, because even though the dog could wander the fields, chase deer, bark at birds, it always returned here, to the hearth, to the bowl, to the place where people waited for it before they touched their own food. Imagine that. Imagine growing up in a world where your first lesson in patience wasn't from a parent, or a teacher, or a spoken rule, but from a quiet animal licking its paw beside the fire, where you didn't eat until it did, where you watched its breath to know the world was calm, where its paws became your paws, not because of hierarchy, not because of punishment, but because that's just how things worked, and everyone accepted it. So when someone says the Vikings were wild, chaotic, brutal, structured, ask them about the dog. Ask them about the silent meal where 30 adults waited for a creature to lie down, asked them about the ritual, the rhythm, the trust, and about the deeper rule underneath it all. That in the heart of the longhouse, even something as simple as dinner could be shaped not by strength, but by stillness, by watching first, eating second, and honoring, always, the one who kept the silence safe. You've waited with the others. You've watched the dog move. You've felt the hush of a Viking longhouse just before the first bite. Now, you know not to lift your spoon until the dog has made its subtle decision whether to sit, lie, sniff, or ignore. This isn't superstition. It's a tradition shaped by centuries of animal logic and communal survival. But what happens after the dog has eaten? When the room, filled with stale smoke and the soft shifting of woolen tunics, finally exhales sand, food begins to pass from hand to hand. That moment, the quiet green light of canine approval ushers in something more than just dinner. It signals the return of order, and in Viking life, that order was fragile, easily broken, carefully repaired, rebuilt daily through rituals that made little sense to outsiders, but everything to those within. Once the meal begins, the dog fades into the background, almost like a spirit released. It will curl near the hearth or under a bench, never asking, never barking, never returning to the spotlight until the very end. In that way, it is both guardian and ghost, but its role is far from over, because what happens during the meal often depends on what the dog did beforehand. If the dog had eaten enthusiastically, the mood would often relax. The stew, usually simple dried cod or lamb fat, water thickened with barley, seemed to taste richer, safer. Conversation might even start early. Someone might hum. Someone else might laugh softly at a memory from that morning's fishing trip. But if the dog had hesitated or worse, refused to eat, then every bite was shadowed. People would whisper, eyes would track one another, bowls would be set down halfway through, and the talk would never quite lift off. Sometimes the stew was simply over-salted. Sometimes there was something else, a grudge, a whisper, a guest whose presence felt just a little too sudden. And in those moments, the memory of what the dog had done became part of the meal itself, not as discussion, but as atmosphere. Now, let's look at the practicality behind all this, because it's easy to romanticize Viking dogs, easy to picture them as mystical beings with runes on their foreheads, frost on their backs. But the truth is, both simpler and more impressive. Viking dogs were trained over years. From pups, they were exposed to the smells of the cooking hearth, the bubbling of porridge, the sharp brine of pickled herring, the strong fat of boiled seal or goat, and just as young boys were taught to bind nets or wield axes, pups were taught by observation and correction when to beg, when to wait, and most importantly, when to alert. One bark too early, a swat with a stick too quiet during a knock at the door, a withheld bone. But if the dog sat still at the right time, or turned its head at the faintest sound, reward. In this way, the dog became a sensor, an extension of the longhouse itself. It could detect wind before the people inside heard it in the thatch dot. It could smell strangers before their boots touched the threshold. And yes, could smell meat that had turned before a human tongue ever noticed. So mealtime became a confirmation ritual. The dog's first movement, a glance, a paw lift, confirmed what no one else could say aloud: that the pot was safe, that the stew wasn't foul, that today, at least, you would eat and live. This might sound dramatic, but consider this. In a world without preservatives, without refrigeration, without pasteurization, the average household meal had dozens of opportunities to turn deadly. Fish that had fermented too long in the barrel, pork stored too close to wool, goat milk left just an hour too long near a heat source, botulism, foodborne parasites, mold. The Vikings didn't have names for these, but they had experience. They had the memory of uncles who died from shellfish, of entire feasts that ended with groaning bellies and silent funerals. So, no letting the dog eat first wasn't quaint. It was life-saving. And now, picture a child watching all of this unfold for the first time. A girl of 7 or 8, sitting beside her mother, watching as the dog walks forward, sniffing, licking, stepping back, listening to the slight change in her father's breath, the signal that it's time to pass the bowls. The child doesn't ask questions. She just watches. And the next night, when the fish is different and the dog hesitates for 1 extra second, she notices. She doesn't eat right away. She waits. She learns. This is how the Viking world passed on its codes, not through instruction, but through shared experience. And this training through observation made its way into more than just meals. It shaped law in Norse legal culture. Witnesses were often expected to have seen with their own eyes, not merely heard by ear. This was mirrored at the dinner table. The act of seeing the dog eat became its own kind of evidence, proof that the meal was safe, the moment was stable, and more deeply, that you were part of the group who had seen it too. If you arrived late and missed the dog's test, you were out of sync. You might still eat, but you hadn't earned the reassurance the others now shared. You would eat alone, even if seated in the same row. Let's shift now to the symbolic role of the dog, because over time, the Viking dog became a kind of emblem of loyalty, yes, but also of sacrificial clarity. In myth, dogs guarded gates. In ritual, they watched the edges of fire circles. And in daily life, they were offered the first bite not as flattery, but as boundary testers. They moved first so humans didn't have to. They bore the risk. This echoes older, deeper into European traditions in which animals, especially dogs, served as mediators between the natural world and the human dot. In some burial sites, dogs were placed at thresholds, doorways, fire pits, even the feet of the dead. This suggests their role wasn't just practical, it was liminal. They were watchers of beginnings, and in Viking mealtime, the beginning was everything. You might be wondering what happened when the dog was gone. What if it died, or ran off, or aged into confusion? In those moments, the loss was felt keenly. Some longhouses trained a new dog. Others relied on human tasters, usually lower status members of the household, who ate first and were quietly watched. But the memory of the dog lingered. People would say things like, "Skull would have barked at this," or "The stew never smelled right after Loki passed." In that way, the dog became ancestral, not as a spirit, exactly, but as a benchmark, a presence whose absence made people question their instincts, and in that doubt, hesitation returned. Sometimes, meals were delayed. Sometimes they were skipped, because the dog had once held that much power, and when it was gone, trust had to be rebuilt from scratch. Now, fast forward to a mealtime where things have gone smoothly. The dog has eaten. The food has been passed. The last scraps are being wiped up with pieces of old bread. And once again, the dog moves. It rises, stretches, yawns, and then, without being told, walks toward the outer door. Someone stands, opens it. The dog sniffs the threshold, the air dot, then returns inside and lies down again. Now, everyone knows. The outside is quiet. No strangers approaching. No wolves in the fields. No changes in the wind. The meal is truly over. And so the longhouse falls into a second silence, deeper than the first. A silence that says, "You're safe. For now," because the one who always knew first has spoken last. Without a word, the fire has dimmed. The bowls are scraped clean, their contents long gone. The clatter of wooden spoons has fallen silent, and the dog now lies motionless by the hearth, its ears perked only slightly in the amber haze of the evening. You might think this is the end of the meal, but for a Viking longhouse, it's something quieter, a transition. The moment after eating when bellies are full, voices low, and minds wanderous when the lessons of the evening settle in. And for those who understood the order of things, what the dog did was only the beginning. In the twilight after supper, when talk drifted toward stories or sleep, the dog's presence often remained subtly central. Not in a grand or symbolic way, but like a clock one didn't look at but always obeyed. The dog's position near the hearth marked more than just warmth. It marked the pulse of the household. If the dog got up and moved toward the door, someone followed, maybe to stoke the fire, maybe to check the path outside. If it stirred restlessly, watchers took note. Perhaps the weather was changing. Perhaps a fox was nearby. Perhaps something else. A change in the dog's behavior could ripple through the evening without a word. This strange sort of animal barometer, woven so tightly into Viking domestic rhythm, wasn't rare. In fact, across longhouse culture, it was expected. Why? Because Viking life, for all its raids and longboats and war songs, was actually built on waiting for spring, waiting for herring runs, waiting for the wind to shift just enough to launch a ship without capsizing it. And in that culture of waiting, those who thrived were those who listened, not just to men or gods, but to animals. Now, let's look at something seemingly small: leftovers. What wasn't eaten at the meal was often given to the dog, but not as a casual handout. The ritual of giving mattered. The scraps weren't tossed. They were presented quietly, sometimes with a hand on the dog's shoulder, sometimes with a muttered phrase like, "for good watching," or "tell the dark to stay away." These weren't prayers. They weren't even superstitions in the modern sense. They were customs of gratitude, recognition that the dog had once again done its job, tasted first, warned if needed, and stayed silent if safe. In return, it was fed last, but with honor. You might think of this as small, but in a culture without monetary wages inside the household, this was payment. The food was currency. The ritual of sharing it was a contract, one not made with parchment, but with steaming fish bones and scraps of barley. And over time, this exchange became cultural memory in later Norse poetry. Dogs appear at pivotal moments, not just in kennels or fields, but at the gates of halls or by the feet of kings. These weren't random insertions. They reflected real expectations that dogs were part of the observing class. They didn't speak, but they remembered. They saw who came and went. They noticed when a stranger smiled without warmth. They smelled lies and sweat. And so, to feed them after dinner wasn't just an act of care. It was a quiet investment. Keep watching. Stay loyal. Remember who we are. Let's take a brief detour to one longhouse in northern Norway, circa the late 9th century. Excavations at Borg, on the island of Vestfjord, uncovered a grand Viking longhouse over 80 meters long. Within its remains, archaeologists found cooking pits, refuse heaps, fish bones, Kayan Yeskanine remains, carefully buried, not discarded, not dumped with trash, buried, as if the dog's role in the house warranted ritual closure when its watch was over. This burial tells us something vital, that dogs in the Viking world were more than livestock. They were household souls, and when they died, the memory of their loyalty had to be honored, just as a fallen warrior might be sent off with a burning ship or a mound in some sagas. Dogs are even named alongside warriors in battle, but in the home, their war was quieter, against rot, against threat, against the unknown. As the evening wore on in the longhouse, talk might turn to other dogs, not just the one present, but ancestral dogs. Remember Fen? It's the one who wouldn't let the storm boy enter? Or Tovi, once barked at the trader from down the fewer turns. Out he was hiding silver under his cloak. These stories weren't about the dogs, exactly. They were about judgment, about trust. They taught children to read behavior, to observe more, speak less, to let instinct guide when words failed. And what better way to learn than by watching the one who always watched first? Now, consider the child again. The girl from before, now slightly older. She's helping prepare the meal, cutting tough roots with a dull blade, counting dried fish from the rack. She looks to the dog, now old and slow, notices it hasn't moved toward the hearth. She doesn't panic, but she asks her mother quietly, "Should we wait?" And the mother, though busy, looks up, because in a world without clocks, awareness was the only timekeeper. The dog had always signaled when the meal could begin. Now it's hesitating. Why? It's too much salt, a bad catch, or something more subtle. Shift in the air, a presence at the door. That question, small, whispered, but full of meanings, the child's first lesson in leadership. Eventually, all dogs pass on, and with them, the cadence of a longhouse might change. A new pup would come, hesitant, barking at shadows, begging before its turn. The people would wait. Training would begin again, not with commands, but with ritual, giving the pup the first bite even when it didn't understand why, letting it sniff, walk, sit, correcting it gently when it rushed, the pot or barked without reason. And in time, the pup would learn what the elder dog had known, that silence means trust, that movement means permission, that instinct, when shaped by care, becomes wisdom. And once again, the longhouse would move in rhythm. Bites would begin after the dog's blessing. Today, we don't live in longhouses. We don't wait for dogs to approve our dinners. We have fridges and thermometers, expiry dates and labels. But something of that Viking instinct remains. We still watch the dog in the room. We still notice when it growls at a stranger or lays by someone's feet. We say things like, "Dogs, no," even if we don't understand. How? Because part of us remembers that long ago, before the meal began, we waited for the dog, and in that pause, we learned how to watch, how to listen, and most importantly, how to wait for the right moment to begin. The fire always told a story, even when it didn't crackle, even when no one spoke. In the old Viking world, especially in the longhouses, stretched across fjords and rocky inlets, it wasn't just the firewood you smelled. It was the person who led it, the lineage that guarded it, the hands that stirred it, and, strangely, it was the smoke that told you all of this. Long before greetings were exchanged or names given, the column of smoke rising from a longhouse's central hearth told passing neighbors, rivals, canned travelers, everything they needed to know. It told them who ruled inside, not just the chief, not just a wife, but the entire web of authority, tradition, survival, and hierarchy. Because in Viking culture where formal writing was sparse and carved runes conveyed only essential smoke, became a language of its own, and understanding it was as necessary as reading any scroll. Let's imagine you're walking along the stony path that leads toward a small settlement. It's late autumn, the wind is calm, the air dry, and your cloak smells faintly of salt from the sea. In the distance, thin smoke lines drift upward from two longhouses. One rises in a straight line, nearly invisible against the skylight, faint and pale gray. The other curls low and clings to the rooftop, fat and sluggish and darker in tone. You stop walking. You watch. You don't need to ask who lives where, because in this region, it's the color, weight, and direction of the smoke tells you what you're stepping into. The cleaner the burn, the better the fuel. Birch and alder, when properly dried, burn. Hot and clean, producing light smoke that rises fast and vanishes quickly. But damp peat, moldy straw, resin heavy pine, not yet seasoned. Okay? Smoke is different, sticky, heavy, smelling of old meat and bad dreams. And who used what fuel? That depended entirely on status. The local Gojia chieftain or landowner would have dry stacks of chopped birch and carefully hoarded driftwood. These were resources, stored and traded with care. His smoke would rise clean because his household had the time, wealth, and help to dry and rotate the fuel. But a widow, struggling to keep her home warm after her husband died at sea, she might burn dung and damp moss. Her smoke would hug the house like regret. And so, even if she said nothing, her hardship announced itself with every breath of wind. But it wasn't just the kind of smoke. It was also the time it appeared. Regular smoke by sunrise. That meant discipline. A household with structure. The fire was lit on time. The porridge pot was already hanging over coals. The dog had likely been fed. A day of weaving, mending, or fish cleaning was beginning with purpose. But smoke that came to Lator, not at all. It meant something had gone wrong. A sick child, a broken pot, a fight, perhaps even mourning, when neighbors passed by and saw no smoke. They sometimes left small gifts, firewood, salt, or flatbread, the doorstep without knocking. Because no smoke meant the house was out of rhythm, and helping it return was not charity, it was communal necessity. Even visitors learned to read this. If you were a traveling craftsman, scout, or a cousin from another fjord, you didn't barge into the first longhouse you saw. You waited, watched the smoke, listened for its crackle. In some traditions, smoke that hissed caused by wet logs was considered a warning. Too much hiss. And you might reconsider entering. It could mean a badly kept house, or one where recent death had drawn too much moisture into the walls and no one wanted to eat. In a home where grief was still in the air. So travelers waited, sometimes an hour or more, until the smoke cleared or changed, or simply stopped hissing. Let's pause here to observe just how deeply embedded fire and smoke were in Viking domestic life. Inside the longhouse, the hearth wasn't just a stove. It was the nucleus of the structurites' architectural, social, and spiritual core. It was positioned at the center of the long axis. Everything else, beds, benches, storage, animals, was arranged around it. It was where food was cooked, where cloth was dried, where elders sat to tell stories, where infants were laid in cradles, near the warm stones, and above it, a smoke hole knot, a chimney cut into the roof, with sometimes a leather flap or wooden shutter to control the draft. But here's the key. That smoke never truly left. It lingered because Viking longhouses were low and windowless, with turf or thatch roofs. The smoke from every fire lingered in the upper air, coating beams, blackening rafters, soaking into memory. Visitors often commented on this, the smell of fish, wool, soot, and skin, all blending into a singular household scent, which meant that, over time, each longhouse developed its own smoke identity. People said things like, "I knew it was their stew before I stepped inside," or, "His smoke clings like jealousy," or even, "You could smell that house's luck from the road." The smoke didn't just stay inside. It traveled, touching clothes, clinging to cloaks. And here's where it became even more revealing. When someone visited a neighboring longhouse or worse, a rival's hall, they returned with the other houses. Smoke on them, and everyone noticed. They didn't say anything, but they sniffed, and they remembered in this way. Smoke became a kind of gossip unspoken, but heavily noted. To carry another longhouse of smoke was to carry its alliances, its moods, its secrets. Now, imagine a child, perhaps 9 or 10, learning this for the first time. He goes to help his uncle sharpen a blade in another settlement. He returns, and as he enters the threshold of his own home, his mother pauses. She sniffs. "You went to Oscar's." It's not a question. The boy hesitates. He wonders, how did she know? But the answer curls from his cloak in a thin thread of foreign firewood, and he learns, in that moment, that his movements leave a trail, not just in footprints, but in smoke. We sometimes imagine Viking culture as loud, boisterous, filled with horn blasts and ale songs, but the reality was often far quieter. It was a world of sensing, of watching how someone stirred a pot, of noticing which side of the hearth they sat on, of tracking how smoke moved through the air after the door opened. This constant, silent awareness helped maintain balance in a world without clocks, police, or written laws. If someone's smoke began to smell strange, too much sweet pitch, or the wrong kind of strite was noticed. If a new woman joined a household, and the fire began to crackle louder than before, people talked. Her fire sings louder than her tongue, they'd say, meaning she brings energy or danger. As the evening approached, in most homes, the smoke changed again. Night fires were smaller, just enough warmth, not too much crackle. Too much fire at night was suspicious. It suggested someone was hiding something or preparing to move. Raiding parties, in particular, were known to overfeed their hearts before departure, drying cloaks, boots, and ropes. And so, if a household burned too hot at night, neighbors stayed alert. Was it celebration, or preparation, or worse, farewell? Smoke, once again, delivered the message before anyone could. And when someone died, the smoke changed entirely. A fire would be let die naturally. No coals were used. The next heart lighting would happen with new tinder often outside, in silence, then brought back in. The first smoke from that fire was sacred. It was watched closely, sniffed, noted. If it rose clean, it meant the dead had left peacefully. If it swirled or turned back toward the door, it meant something unspoken was unresolved. In this way, smoke itself was mourned. It carried more than heat. It carried the end of someone's breath and the beginning of new memory. So the next time you see a chimney's faint trail drifting against a pale sky, remember, to the Vikings, it meant more than warmth. It meant rhythm, hierarchy, emotion, discipline, grief, gossip. Trust, it told them, who had fuel, and who had favor, who had time to dry wood, and who was burning whatever they could find. The smoke told them everything, even when no one else did. By now, you've seen how the smoke of a Viking longhouse was more than air and ash. It was history in motion and written, unspeaking, but known. But let's sit a little longer with the fire. Let's not rush to the next tale just yet, 'cause the hearth and the people who tended it didn't just tell you where power lived. They also told you what kind of power it was. And as strange as it may seem, one of the clearest signs of that came not from the men at the table, but from the women who fed the flame. In Norse households, especially before Christianization, women were guardians of the fire, not symbolically, but literally. The wife or matriarch of the house didn't just cook. She controlled the fire in all its forms, lighting it, feeding it, watching it, reading it. This wasn't housework. It was responsibility, because in a world where fire cooked every meal, warmed every child, dried every boot, softened every cloth, and lit every story, control of the flame meant control of continuity. If she failed to tend the fire properly, the household suffered. If she tended it too closely, hoarded kindling, or let it burn at night when it shouldn't, people noticed. Even visitors might comment, "Her smoke is always early. Oh, that fire eats faster than the sheep do." Small remarks, but they added up. So the way a woman fed her hearth became a public language, even if her words were few. Consider the moment when a new bride entered a longhouse. One of her first gestures, quiet, nearly ceremonial, was to light the morning fire, not just once, but for several days, and people would watch her smoke. If it drifted clean and quickly, she was patient. If it choked or scattered, She was nervous or unskilled. If it flared too fast, perhaps she'd used birch bark, good for catching, but poor for sustaining. A sign she hadn't learned yet when to burn slow. In this way, smoke became a reflection of her adaptability. Her worth was not just spoken, it was smelled. And it wasn't only women, children, who were tested by the fire in some regions. Boys around age 10 were expected to build a cooking fire on their own, often while herding animals or watching a fishing camp. If they returned smelling like burnt moss or resin-rich pine, their elders knew they'd wasted fuel. If they smelled of barely anything, just a faint hint of charred, they had burned carefully, with purpose. Even punishment could be delivered through fire. A disobedient teen might be made to rise earlier than the household and keep the coals alive with only damp straw. If he failed, everyone noticed. He wouldn't be scolded directly, but he might not be served first at dinner, or he'd be passed over when it came time to help at the forge or the dock. In Viking life, discipline wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was cold mornings and no smoke to keep you company. Let's return to the hearth in a well-run longhouse. The fire was never fully extinguished. Coals would be banked overnight, pushed under ashes to keep warm. Good firekeeper knew how to shape the ash, how to tilt a small piece of heartwood, just so, and how to rekindle the flame at dawn without new tinder. This banking of coals wasn't just convenience, it was symbolic memory. A banked fire meant continuity. The day had not truly ended, only folded itself inward until it was time to stretch again. But if the coals ever went fully cold, that meant something had broken. A death, a disruption. Departure and starting a fire from scratch wasn't just about heat. It was about recovering rhythm in some households. The fire was considered so central that it was never lit by just one person. On special occasions, like the start of winter, the arrival of an honored guest, or the return from a long voyage, the household would gather and light the flame. Together, one person would hold the flint, another the dried lichen or birch bark, another might strike, and when the fire caught, it wasn't just flame, it was trust. Reborn. The smoke that rose from that kind of lighting was often watched in silence. Did it twist? Did it split? Did it go straight up, as if greeting the sky? Some even believed that smoke that curved east meant the household would see fortune, curved west, illness, or unwelcome news. Now, whether this was truly believed or simply remembered is unclear. But in Viking life, belief and memory were often the same thing. If the story stuck, it mattered. Let's explore one more layer, the ritual extinguishing of a fire. Though rare, there were moments when the hearth was deliberately snuffed out, not just forgotten or fumbled, but fully extinguished. On purpose. This happened in moments of breakage, when a household was dissolved, when a family moved away, when a chieftain died, and his home was to be left empty, or when a curse was suspected. In these cases, the fire was not just put out, it was buried. The coals would be cooled with water, then wrapped in cloth and buried outside the doorway, sometimes with small charms. This extinguishing was a kind of funeral, because the fire had a life of its own and ending. It, without ceremony, risked carrying its spirit with you. You might wonder, how did outsiders learn all of this? How could someone visiting from Iceland to Sweden or from Gotland to Greenland possibly navigate these silent codes? The answer: observation. No one explained. No one handed you a scroll of etiquette. You watch. You stepped slowly. You sat near the fire, not at it. You waited to be invited to stir, or pour, or stoke, and you paid attention to how your smoke curled. Or did in single quotes, because Viking society didn't teach with lectures. It taught with expectation. Some stories tell of skalds, wandering poets who could predict a household's fortune just by spending a night on their bench and watching the smoke. One such tale describes a man who refused to recite his verse until he'd seen the morning smoke. He sat in silence through the feast. Only the next dawn, after the host's fire sent a thin, blue-gray thread into the rising sun, did the skald speak. And what he said was simple. Your house burns clean, let no fool tend it, which was both compliment and warning, because not everyone could be trusted with flame. As the centuries passed and Christian tradition spread, some of these customs faded. Churches introduced new rituals, and written prayers replaced some of the silent observations once held at hearts. But in the countryside, in fjord-tucked settlements, on windswept farms, the old ways lingered. You can still find them, buried in folk sayings. He burns like a bachelor's hearth, her fires too clean to need a priest, or even, no smoke is the loudest noise. These phrases weren't metaphors, they were records, and they point to a time, and even your chimney told the world who you were. And maybe that's what the Vikings understood best, that the subtle signals, the rising threads, the scent of morning, kindling, the quiet coals under wool blankets, held more truth than most declarations. You didn't have to shout your role. You didn't have to prove your worth. If your smoke drifted right, people knew. And if it didn't, they knew that too. Let us stay a little longer with the smoke. By now, you've seen how it wound itself into the very heartbeat of a Viking household, as something exotic or symbolic, but as something boring, essential, and quietly revealing. But in this final section, we followed the smoke outward beyond the thatched longhouse roofs and into the wide fields, the boatyards, and even the halls of power. Because in the Viking world, the fire didn't just cook. The smoke didn't just rise. Together, they told a story of ownership, allegiance, and memory written not in ink, but in ash. Let's begin with the outbuildings. A Viking homestead was rarely a single structure. Surrounding the longhouse were smaller buildings, barns, granaries, smithies, even small guest shelters. Each of them had a hearth of sorts. Some were simple stone rings, others more formal fire pits. But what mattered wasn't the design. It was the smoke's signature. An experienced farmhand could tell which building was being used even from across a frozen field simply by watching how and when the smoke lifted. The forge smoke was fast, hot, and dark, especially when bellows were in use. It hung low, hugged the earth, and left a trail of iron and soot on the snow. The smoke from the dairy house, on the other hand, was thin and intermittent. It rose early, disappeared quickly. Why? Because curdling, boiling, and scalding milk required brief but intense heat and, then nothing, silence. Over time, these rhythms became recognizable patterns. If the forge smoked at dawn, something was broken. If the guest house had smoke at noon, someone had overstayed. And if the main longhouse had no smoke at all by midday, something was wrong. So the land itself became a kind of visual diary, written in wisps and curls in larger settlements. This scale of smoke reading grew more complex. In Hidabi, Birka, or Kopank, thriving Viking towns with multiple homes and workshops, people knew to read the town's mood by its morning smoke. A prosperous morning was noisy, full of overlapping plumes. The bakeries smoked early thick, pleasant smoke scented with yeast and firewood. The leatherworkers burned hide scraps that stank and billowed. In the bathhouses, rare but present in trade hubs, burned aromatic twigs, juniper, birch, or herbs to fill the rooms with steam and smell. If you were a visitor, you might find it chaotic. But if you lived there, you could tell which vendor had opened early, which family had visitors, which alley was still asleep. You didn't need to ask. You just looked up. Now, let's travel even further out, to the edges of settlement, where winter bit harder and fire was sacred for another reason: survival. Here, fire wasn't only a sign of comfort, was a signal to others. We are still alive. The high hills of Icelandic farms, neighbors couldn't always visit, especially in snowbound months, okay? But they could see smoke, so families developed habits. Lighting the hearth at the same time each morning, banking it at night with a specific kind of wood, whose smoke left a distinct trail. This wasn't superstition. It was a mutual pact. My fire still burns. Yours too. Good. If smoke didn't rise from a neighbor's chimney 2 mornings in a row, it was understood someone should go check, even if the wind howled. Even if it meant trudging through a white field with only a lantern and the sound of ravens. The fire was a heartbeat. Its absence meant something had failed. But what happened when smoke wasn't from hearts, but from funeral pyres? Here, the message was louder, grander, okay? And perhaps final. Viking cremations, though not universal, were practiced in many parts of Scandinavia, especially before Christianity. When a prominent figure died, chieftain, elder, seeress, their body might be burned with goods, tools, weapons, and sometimes animals, even a small boat. They were wealthy. The fire burned hot and long, and the smoke was visible for miles. It was meant to be. Villages nearby would pause their own fires to watch. Some would send a single child up a hill to report on the direction of the wind and the size of the plume. If it rose clean and pale, they said, the dead were at peace. If it rolled dark and slow, something had been buried wrong. And while such interpretations seemed mystical, they also served a cultural function. They kept the dead woven into the world of the living, not through grave visits or tombstones, but through the memory of a day when the sky changed color. And in these funerals, another odd tradition emerged. When the pyre was lit, nearby households would cover or extinguish their hearth-saving for just a moment. This was a gesture of respect, but also of symbolic silence. The fire that burned the dead must be the only one seen for that hour. It was a final gift, undivided sky. No other smoke should compete then. After the pyre was finished and ashes cooled, homes would relight their own fires, and for just a moment, the settlement would seem to breathe again. But perhaps the most surprising use of fire and smoke came not in mourning, but in warnings. Signal fires. We think of them as dramatic lighting beacons across hills, a la The Lord of the Rings. But in Viking lands, it was more modest, more quiet, more boring. A single fire lit outside the longhouse door, a specific mix of peat and moss, a certain time of day, usually before sunrise. This kind of fire told others trouble. Sometimes it meant invaders, yes, but more often sickness, bad fish, poisoned well. Others saw the smoke, paused, didn't visit that day, passed the word along, and slowly a network of silence formed based entirely on who was lighting what and when. No loud shouts, no messengers, just a plume in the cold, and people knew to wait. Even kings and jarls, those with wealth and war bands, understood that control of fire mattered more than banners. If your household could burn clean through winter, feed all mouths, and send steady smoke day after day, then your people trusted you. If your hearth faltered, your guests went cold, or your smoke choked black, then whispers began. They waste wood. They burn too much salt. They've angered the spirits. Your strength was measured not by armor, but by the reliability of your heat. And if your fire was envied, it burned long into the dark, while others shivered. It meant you either had too much wood or not enough friends. Today, when we think of Viking history, we remember axes, ships, stones, carved with runes. We don't think of smoke, but maybe we should, because it outlasted the raids. It outlasted the kings. It curled from the chimneys of farms long after war ended. And still, somewhere in the rural north, it rises. Even now, in remote valleys, elders remember how the wind carries it and how If you wake early and look across the snow, you can still read the land not with letters, but with lines of gray in a pale sky. That's the strange, silent legacy of Viking fire. It spoke, and if you watched closely, it told you who had power, who had care, who had memory, and who had nothing left at all, at all. You've walked through smoke-filled longhouses. You've watched coals speak silently in the cold. Now come, take a seat, just for a moment, at a Viking feast table. But don't sit just anywhere, because where you sit tells everyone who you are, and if you think that's just ceremonial, just pageantry, you haven't seen what happens when a spoon scrapes the bottom of the salted fish bowl, and all eyes shift toward the man sitting closest to the barrel. This is the story of salt, and how proximity to it was more than flavor, it was rank, law, loyalty, and insult. It begins, as many Viking stories do, not with kings or conquest, but with food. Salt mattered far more than most things at a Viking table, not because it was rare, though in some places it was, but because it preserved. In a world where winter stretched 6 months, where cellars ran wet, and where the only fridge was the snow outside the barn, salt was insurance. It kept fish edible, it kept meat from spoiling, it kept cheese firm and safe. So while bread and porridge were served freely, salted meat, that was offered with care, which meant that the container it came in, the bowl, the dish, the barrel, even the simple wooden spoon became sacred space, and whoever sat closest to it mattered. Longhouse dinners were often communal. Rows of benches, a central table, shared bowls, ladles, knives passed from hand to hand, but no seat was truly neutral. Where you sat was a public declaration of who you were in the household. Orbit. Let's picture a winter feast. Perhaps it's midwinter's celebration, or the feast after a successful voyage, or a wedding. Dozens of people gather. Some are kin, some are allies, some are mere workers, hired for the season. The benches fill up. It's the main dish, a salted leg of lamb, or a barrel of preserved herring is placed on the central board. And here's the rule: no one speaks aloud. He who sits nearest the salt speaks first. This rule isn't written in any Viking law code, but it appears in the sagas, in whispers and complaints in Egil's saga. One guest is insulted by being made to sit behind the salt, near the door, far from the host, in Gredia's saga. A man is refused salt entirely, not because there wasn't enough, but because his honor didn't merit it. These weren't small slights, they were public humiliations, because in Viking social order, honor was edible, and to be kept from the good part of the table was to be told, without words, you are not worth preserving. This created strange dynamics. In smaller houses, there was only one table, so the seating order was easier to manage. But in wealthier home chieftains, ship captains, the longhouse might have multiple tables, or an extended U-shape with the fire in the center. In these cases, the salt was placed centrally, but its orientation dictated the hierarchy. Those on the right side of the salt, meaning nearest the head of the table, were honored. Those below the salt were still inside, but barely, and if you were seated without view of the salt, perhaps near the smoke hole or the back bench, it meant something else entirely. You were tolerated, but not trusted. You were not preserved. It wasn't just about personal ego. Your placement affected your portion, because dishes were passed clockwise and often began from the host's right. Those seated nearest to him received the first spoonfuls, the largest cuts, the most intact slices of salted pork. By the time the dish reached the lower seats, what remained were bones, ends, scraps. So to sit low was to eat last, and last. And in a culture where hunger could be fatal by March. This was not symbolic, it was survival. This made every feast a game of subtle power plays. Guests arrived early, not just for courtesy, but to be visible as seats were assigned. Allies were escorted to the bench closest to the salt. Strangers were observed as they sat. If someone presumed to seat themselves too high, the host might raise an eyebrow. Worse, remain silent when the salted dish passed, and silence was louder than protest. Because when the salt passed, you, but not to you, it said more than words. Children learned this early. They weren't allowed to reach for the salt directly. Instead, they were expected to ask. This wasn't just manners. It was a quiet education in hierarchy. May I have the salt? Yes, child. From him, not from me. And in that gesture, the child learned who gives, who receives, who waits, and who eats sometimes. Salt was used to test loyalty. A chieftain might place a small bowl of salted berries, very rare, very sweet, between two warriors. He wouldn't say anything, just watch. If one reached quickly, without deference, it marked him as greedy. If the other waited, or offered the bowl first, he was honored in silence. This was how leaders were chosen, not in speeches or sword fights, but in small, salted silences. Of course, salt had its dangers. To spill it was a grave offense, not for superstition's sake, but because it was waste. And waste, in Viking logic, was dishonor. If someone knocked the salt bowl, even by accident, the table might go quiet. Apologies were offered quickly. Sometimes, the one who spilled would offer a token and armband, a tool, even a promise to do extra work to repay the lost salt. Because once it fell to the floor, it could not be used, and no Viking worth his grain would gather tainted salt. Interestingly, the Christianization of the North only reinforced these habits. In early churches, salt was used in baptisms and exorcisms, symbolizing purity and preservation. But even before these rituals arrive, Vikings already knew salt keeps the rot away, so it was sacred, and to be seated near it was a sign that you, too, preserved the house. At weddings, the newlywed couple would be seated nearest the salt knot, just for honor, but as a blessing. May your union preserve like this meat. At funerals, the bowl might be removed, entirely signifying that someone had been lost, that no amount of salt could keep them now. Or, in rare cases, guests of great dishonor would be seated without salt entirely. They'd be given broth or plain bread, not because the house was poor, but because they were not worth the flavor of memory. And in this way, over centuries, something astonishingly dulled just a grain, a bowl. A pinch became a map of how Vikings ordered the world. No banners, no formal announcements, just quiet rituals around a substance that kept food from spoiling and guests from misbehaving. So next time you picture a Viking feast axis slung, ale poured, laughter, thick pause for a moment, and look for the salt. See who reaches, see who. Wait, and ask yourself, if you sat at that table, would you reach for the salt, or wait to be offered it? You're still seated at the long table now, wooden spoon resting quietly in your palm, steam rising from the salted broth in your cup. You've started to notice the way eyes flick toward the bowl of salt when someone speaks. You've seen how a guest, seated far down the bench, clears his throat but is ignored, while another, just a few inches closer to the salt, need only grunt to silence the room. This isn't an accident in the Viking world. Power was rarely written down, but it was always displayed, not in speeches or ceremonies alone, but in seating, sharing, serving. And the salt, beneficent as it might seem, was the anchor of it all. Let's now go deeper, beyond the feasting, beyond the spoon and bowl, because the rules of salt didn't end when dinner did. They extended to trade, to law, and to memory. The salt as a marker of trust in trade. In the early Viking age, coinage was rare. Silver was weighed, not counted. Most trade, whether for furs, fish, or fine woven cloth, happened by weight, by value, by agreement. But how did two people decide what something was worth if neither had scales? The answer, oddly, often involved salt. Imagine this. A ship arrives at a trading port on the Norwegian coast. The merchant aboard offers smoked reindeer, meat be plead preserved, lasting for weeks. The local trader offers amber beads. There's no scale between them. There's no fixed currency. Instead, a small dish of salt is passed between hands. The merchant dips a pinch, tastes it. The amber seller does the same. If the salt is clean, rich, sharp, it's a sign of respect. It says, I offer you preservation. I do not deceive. If the salt is damp, lumpy, or scattered with impurities, it signals carelessness, dishonesty, or poverty. The deal might not happen at all. So salt became a kind of unspoken oath, one that could be tasted. Some merchants even carried their own salt, carefully stored in small horn boxes to offer as proof that their goods had traveled well, stayed dry, and were kept with care. Salt was the icebreaker, the promise, and the test, all in a single grain. Legal customs before the salt, but the salt bowl didn't only appear on dinner tables and trade routes. It also sat quietly, meaning fleon law tables and Viking legal tradition. Disputes were settled at the Thing, a communal gathering, where free men met to decide matters of law, inheritance, and honor. At these gatherings, temporary longhouses, or tents, were often raised. Inside, a table might be set for the most senior law speakers and chieftains, and there at the center was the salt bowl. It served a specific purpose when a case was brought forward. The accuser and the accused were sometimes seated on opposite sides of the table. The salt was placed directly in between. The symbolism was subtle, but weighty. To sit beside the salt meant you were still within the circle of trust. To sit across from it, out of reach, meant your trust had been broken, or at least was under question. In some regions, if the accused was cleared of charges, the law speaker would offer him a small pinch of salt if he was found guilty. No such gesture was made. Again, no dramatic rituals, no bells, just salt passed or withheld. It was justice. Flavored salt in marriage and family order. Family meals, too, had their unspoken rules around the salt. The head of the household sat near it, yes, but in some homes, the second closest seat was even more closely watched, because that seat was often reserved for the heir, the eldest son, the chosen niece, or the trusted foster child. If you were seated next to the salt, it meant something very specific. You would inherit the hearth. You would be the one to carry the family's preservation forward, its land, its livestock, and yes, its store of salt. In this way, inheritance wasn't first announced with a formal declaration. It was first implied by a seat at dinner. Guests who noticed might raise an eyebrow. Rivals might complain in private. But no one would say it aloud, because in Viking tradition, many truths were not told, they were placed. And when father pushed the salt bowl slightly closer to his daughter's side of the table, he was saying everything, the dangerous power of withdrawing the salt. But what about the opposite gesture? What happened when someone's seat was moved away from the salt? That, dear listener, was one of the coldest forms of social exile. This wasn't public punishment, like being flogged or branded. It wasn't loud or cruel. It was its absence. One day, you arrived for dinner, and your place was no longer at the main table. You were seated on the outer bench. Your dish came late, and when the salted lamb was passed around, it skipped your bowl entirely. Nobody said anything. Nobody had to. You had been salted out. This quiet expulsion was used when no form of punishment applied, when someone hadn't broken a law, exactly, but had lost honor. A man who failed to return borrowed tools. A woman who gossiped too deeply. A cousin who struck a guest during a feast. No need for a fight. No need for banishment. Just remove the salt. The message was clear. And unless you earned your way back in by apology, by service, or by public display of honor, you might find yourself eating forever at the edge of the table. Monks, outsiders, and their place at the table, interestingly, This logic extended even to foreigners. As Christianity began to spread through the north, monks and missionaries began to appear at Longhouse doors, tired, hungry, preaching strange doctrines. Hosts were often curious. Hospitality was sacred. But where were these strange men seated? Not near the salt. Not yet. Instead, they were given broth, ale, or unsalted bread. Something warm but plain. They were observed only over time, weeks, months, as if the household came to trust them, believe them, or find use in their presence. Were they moved closer to the salt bowl? One bishop recorded in a letter to his monastery in York that only after my third winter among the Northmen was I offered salt without first asking. He considered it a miracle, but perhaps it was just how trust tastes. Salt in memory and mourning finally. We arrive at memory. Because even in death, the salt remained a part of life. When someone died, their chair was often left empty for several feasts, but the salt was not removed. Instead, it sat untouched in front of their place. No one reached across it. No one ate from it. It was a silent placeholder, a way of saying, this one was preserved. Now we remember. After a set number of days, depending on region, status, and season, the salt bowl would be removed, often with a small piece of black cloth wrapped around it. In some cases, it was buried with the dead. In others, placed on a high shelf and never used again, a way of marking the end of a life that had been worthy of preservation. And so, for many generations, spicing, a bowl on a table, became a social code book. A bowl of salt, so easily overlooked, became a marker of trust, a measure of inheritance, a test of loyalty, a way to shame, a way to honor, and a way to mourn. So, as the fire dies down tonight and the table empties, you may wonder who would sit nearest the salt if we were all seated together. Now, and more curiously still, would anyone quietly shift their seat just to get a little closer, The bowl is still there, even though the fire's nearly out and only embers pulse beneath the ash. No one has moved it. The salt sits on the table, untouched now, its tiny crystals glittering faintly in the low light. Around it, the bowls are empty, the bread gone, the mead quiet in its jug, but the salt remains quiet, present, watching, and you begin to understand that in this world, this Viking household is quiet, hierarchical, deeply instinctual world. Salt wasn't just for food, it was for memory, it was for identity, it was the axis around which the room turned. Earlier in the evening, while the meat was still warm and the spoons still busy, you might not have noticed the way things were arranged. It all looked simple, rough bowls, shared ladles, places chosen by custom rather than invitation, but everything had meaning. Who passed the salt and to whom? Who ignored it? Who reached across without asking? And who placed it back in the center after serving themselves? These movements formed a subtle choreography, a dance of familiarity, deference, entitlement, and humility. And the closer someone sat to the salt, the fewer movements they needed to make. That was the mark of true power in a longhouse. Not how much noise you made, but how little effort you needed to exert. In many Norse households, especially those belonging to minor nobility, these rules around salt weren't just social. They were enforced through inherited patterns. Family sagas describe how the placement of the salt bowl became tradition. In one tale from the Icelandic sagas, a father, on his deathbed, tells his sons not to fight over the inheritance, but to follow the salt, because it will know the right place to sit. That line might sound poetic, but it's deeply practical. In many families, the salt bowl was kept in a specific spot, often on a carved wooden board at the head of the table. It wasn't moved, didn't travel. People moved around it. So when guests came or a son returned from raiding, or a foster brother grew into manhood, where they sat in relation to the salt, told everyone how things stood. There was no announcement, quiet, no declaration. The salt spoke silently, and that was enough. Now, let's imagine an evening feast where something went wrong. A visitor, cousin from the next fjord sits too close. Not maliciously, but unknowingly. The host family stiffens. One uncle leans forward. The young man glances at his older brother with a tight-lipped frown, but nobody says anything. They let the meal begin, but the guest's bowl is not filled until others have been served. When he reaches for the salt, the host gently blocks his hand, not rudely, but as if distracted. The signal is clear. He is out of order. He has not earned that closeness. Perhaps by the next meal, he will be seated differently, or not invited at all. That is how the system corrected itself, not with scolding or expulsion, but with quiet rearrangements. The Longhouse was a place of visible behavior, invisible law. But what happens when the law is tested? When someone refuses the rules to happen? A story from the 10th century. Gill's saga tells of a guest named Scully who insisted on sitting at the host's right hand, nearest the salt and the hearth. He claimed to be of noble blood. He told loud stories. He made bold toasts, but when the salt bowl came around, the host quietly passed him directly to a younger cousin seated farther away. Scully noticed. He stood, made a scene, accused the host of insult, and then calmly, without raising his voice, the host replied, "If your place were known, it would not need to be spoken. Okay? But the salt does not lie." That was the end of the matter. Scully left the next morning. No blood was spilled, no feud begun, because the salt silent as ever had done its work. In rare cases, salt even found its way into ritual justice. In a few accounts, especially from Christianized areas of late Viking era Scandinavia, we hear of something called salt witness. This was not a legal practice in the modern sense. Rather, it was a symbolic oath. When two people swore not to break a truce or not to steal from one another, they would share a bowl of salted porridge. Both would take a bite. Then the bowl would be broken, not just emptied, shattered. The idea was that the agreement, it's like the bowl, could never be reassembled. To violate the agreement after eating was to swallow dishonor, and in some localities, that was taken seriously. If someone broke the oath, they might find themselves banned, not just from one home, but from all salt-sharing gatherings in the region. Their food would come unsalte, their stories left unanswered, their seat empty. This form of social death was quieter than exile, but often it was harder to survive. Interestingly, ancient etiquette found echoes centuries later in medieval and early modern Europe, where sitting above the salt or below the salt became shorthand for one's place in society. At English and French banquets, a literal salt cellar was placed on the high table. Guests of rank sat above it. Lesser folks sat below. But the roots of that idea trace back to these Norse customs where salt marked not luxury, but order, not spice, structure. And now we come back to the salt bowl, sitting in front of you. Maybe it's still full. Maybe just a few flecks remained at the bottom. It has served its purpose for the evening. It has shown everyone where they stand. It has given permission, withheld approval, rewarded loyalty, remembered the dead, and guarded the flow of conversation. It's like a silent host. The spoon may stir the stew, the knife may carve the meat, but the salt will motionless. Central holds the story, and when the meal ends, it will be the last thing to be put away, handled with quiet hands, returned to its shelf, preserved, and so. Even today, if you feel someone adjusting their seat at a dinner table, if you see them angling for the center, if someone hovers too long near the head of the table, or another person moves back without being asked, it might not be about food, it might be about the salt, about something ancient and unspoken, something passed down not in books, but in bowls, because long before we had laws written in stone or ink, we had the law of who sat nearest the salt, and for those who knew how to watch, it said everything. You are seated at the long table once more. This time, the scene is different. The meal is in full motion. A stew of barley and greens is being ladled into wooden bowls. Thick rye bread is passed down the line, and the meat smoked lamb, cut thin and tough, is being chewed slowly. There's no singing tonight, no toasting, no laughter. Just the rhythmic, low sound of chewing. Silence. Because here, in this Viking longhouse, you do not speak while chewing, not because it's rude, though it is, not because it's unsightly, though it might be, but because, long ago, in households like this, the act of speaking while chewing was seen as dangerous, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but physically, spiritually, socially. Let's explore the rules behind the silence, the deeply embedded, inherited customs that told a Norse child when to speak and when not to dare open their mouth with food inside it. Because, at the heart of it, was something more than manners. It was about keeping the longhouse alive, a world without background noise. To understand this, you must first imagine the soundscape of a Viking home. There are no clocks ticking, no radios humming, no background music, no gentle whir of appliances. There is only what is happening now in this space. So the sound of chewing wet, slow, uneven, was not just background noise, it was the foreground, and interrupting it, even accidentally, was like breaking the surface of still water. It drew eyes. It changed the rhythm of the room, especially during meals where silence had been declared, because, in some households, there were meals of silence and meals of speech. The morning porridge, often eaten quickly before work began, was silent. No jokes, no complaints, just scooping, swallowing, and leaving evening meals, especially during feast days, allowed more voice. But even then, the timing was crucial. The rule was this: speak only between the bites, not during them. Your teeth were moving, your mouth was closed, because to do otherwise, to talk while chewing, was to break something older than law. Fear of choking. A real risk. You must also remember that Viking food was not always easy to eat. Tough meat, crusts, porridge, so thick it could be sliced. These were meals that demanded attention to eat and speak at once, risked choking. And in a world without advanced medicine, that was more than a mishap, was a life-threatening event. A man who choked in the hall might never breathe again. A child who coughed up a barley hoe into the wrong passage could be gone before the healer arrived. And so, rules formed, not just as etiquette, but as survival. There were even cautionary tales told to children. In the dim candlelight, he opened his mouth with meat on his tongue, and the gods closed it for good. Or, a fool who speaks with stew in his throat will drown on dry land. These weren't just rhymes. They were remembered warnings, repeated so often they became second nature. So the children watched their parents eat in silence and learned. 1. Bite, to choose, swallow, then speak. Ritual and respect in the quiet but beyond safety. There was spiritual order to this silence in some longhouses. Meals were treated almost like rituals. The food was not merely sustenance, it was a gift from gods, its ancestors, and the land itself. To speak over it while still chewing was to dishonor its origin, just as one would not speak during a prayer or walk loudly in a graveyard. One did not speak with "chewed" in their mouth, because the act of eating was sacred, and the silence was part of the respect. Many Viking households had small carvings of gods or protective spirits near the hearth, tiny wooden faces, sometimes painted, often smoke darkened by years of cooking. When food was served, the head of the household might nod toward the hearth, honoring these spirits, and until he took his first bite and swallowed, no one else spoke. This tradition was called in some dialects, matfrieder, the piece of the meal, and breaking the peace by speaking during a bite was seen not only as disruptive, but as disrespectful to the ancestors. The communal pace of eating silence at meals also helped maintain pace. In a world where food was scarce and seconds were not always guaranteed, people had to eat with awareness. Speaking while chewing often meant slowing down, or, conversely, rushing to finish so you could talk. Both were frowned upon. To rush ahead showed selfishness. To delay the group's rhythm created imbalance. Instead, households developed a kind of meal rhythm, an unspoken cadence of scoop, chew, swallow, pause, attentive, appropriate, comment. This pacing helped ensure everyone got their share, that no one finished early and began demanding more before others had even started. The silence helped equality. It helped presence. It helped food be food and not performance. Punishments for speaking while chewing in many Viking homes. Children who broke the chewing silence were not beaten or shamed. They were mocked lightly, gently. A cousin might lean over and say, "A cow that talks while it chews, should we milk your words?" Or a grandmother might chuckle, "Careful, child, speak again with meat in your mouth," and the meat might answer. But if a child did it again, they might be sent outside, told to eat with the dogs, not as punishment, but as a reminder. The dogs, after all, made noise while they ate, and a child who couldn't control their chewing voice was behaving less like a guest and more like a beast. It stung, but it taught. Silent meals after lost silence during chewing was also practiced out of grief. After a death in the family, many households would observe a set of silent meals, one per day. For a number of days, these meals had no conversation, no songs, no toast, only chewing. It was a way of letting the dead speak in the space left behind by your words. Many believed that if you remained quiet while chewing during this time, you might hear a whisper your mind or in your heart of the one who had gone. And so the silence became not a rule, but a form of remembering, of keeping someone near, of listening for ghosts. Between bites, meals in winter versus meals in summer, the rules also shifted slightly with the seasons. In winter, meals were heavier, thicker stews, salt meats, aged cheese. Chewing was longer. The silence lasted more. You could go an entire meal with only 3 or 4 sentences spoken aloud. But in summer, when food was lighter fresh berries, tender greens, thinner gruels, the silence broke more easily. Still, the core rule remained: do not speak while chewing, because even in sunshine, the old habits lived. A bite should be chewed in full. A voice should wait its turn, and a mouth should never carry both meat and words at the same time. Language of eyes and hands. You might be wondering if no one spoke while chewing, how did they communicate during meals? The answer: through eyes and hands. A raised brow could signal agreement. A pointed finger might indicate a need for more mead. A hand on the table, flat, might signal the wish to speak next. And, above all, the pause. When someone finished a bite, leaned back, touched their spoon to the edge of the bowl, there was the moment to speak. They had cleared their mouth. They had honored the rhythm. They were now available. So conversations at Viking meals were not fast, but they were precise, measured, almost musical. And perhaps that's why they were remembered. Now, as your own spoon rests gently on the rim of your bowl, you feel it too. That tension between bite and breath. That knowledge, deep and unspoken, that to speak before swallowing would be more than rude. It would be wrong. Not in the way modern manners are wrong, but in the way that breaks something ancient, a pact, a silence older than the words themselves. And you begin to wonder, what did the first Viking ever to speak while chewing actually say? And did anyone ever speak again after that? So what happened when someone did speak with food in their mouth? What if the stew was just a little too hot? Or the guest a little too bold? Did the heavens open? Or the host rise in anger? Not quite. The reaction was often as telling as the silence itself. In many Viking longhouses, such a breach didn't provoke punishment. It provoked a response coded in posture. A slight turn of the head from the matron, a frozen glance from the elder at the bench's end, or, most cutting of all, the slow, deliberate chewing of every other mouth at the table as if to remind the speaker of the rhythm they had just disturbed. And sometimes that was all it took. The message was clear. You were out of step with the house, out of harmony with the hearth, out of favor, for a moment, with the very breath of the longhouse. Meal as moral mirror to understand why the silence mattered so much. You have to look beyond etiquette. In a Viking household, the meal wasn't just a time to eat. It was a time to mirror the moral structure of the family, from the head of the table to the youngest child at the far edge of the bench. Every gesture, how the spoon was held, how often the bread was passed, how long one paused between bites was a signal, not about hunger, but about self-control, respect, discipline. Speaking while chewing wasn't just uncleaning revealed a lack of inner stillness, a fidgeting soul, a mind that hadn't yet learned to wait. And in a world shaped by long winters, harsh labor, and the constant need for quiet strength, that kind of impatience was feared, because those who couldn't sit still at the table might not hold the line in a shield wall. The widow's table, one of the most quietly powerful enforcers of these silent customs, was often the widow in many Norse households. If the patriarch had died in battle or to disease, the woman of the house did not relinquish her authority. She sat in the same seat. She served the stew. She maintained the order of the evening meal, and her silence carried the weight of her losses. Young visitors or distant cousins who spoke through mouthfuls were quickly brought back to awareness, not with shouts, but with long pauses. The widow might halt her own chewing, look down, set her spoon beside her bowl. The table followed. The offending child or guest would chew quickly, swallow hard, and lower their eyes. Then, slowly, she would resume her meal, and with that, the rhythm was restored. Sound as sacred space, sin Viking culture. Sound had value. Noise wasn't constant. It wasn't background static. It was a gift, offered and received with care. So when you heard only chewing and firecrackle, you were hearing something intentional, a protected space, like a temple without chanting. It's a prayer without words. And when someone broke that silence with a muffled half-speech or garbled commentary, it didn't just disturb the room, it pierced the sacred frame of the meal, which is why speaking while chewing wasn't just considered sloppy, was considered profane. Not in the blasphemous sense, but in the sense of forgetting where you were, forgetting that you weren't eating alone, forgetting that the meal was not just about food, it was about harmony. The child who didn't know better, every household had one story passed down, like a legend about a child who couldn't stop talking during meals. One such tale, cited in rural fjord regions, went like this. There once was a boy who thought himself wise, chewed and he spoke, and he chewed and he lied. When he fell silent, his tongue took a twist, for the words in his mouth no longer wished to exist. It's told with a smile now, as a kind of dark joke, but beneath it lives a truth. Words in Norse life were not cheap. They were craft. Where they're used in oaths, sagas, songs, or everyday speech, they carried weight. To waste them on half-chewed gossip or messy muttering was like spilling grain on muddy ground. And so children learned, it's better to eat in silence than to speak without care. The skalds, quiet intervals, with even the skalds, the storytellers, and poets obeyed. Tease, the no talking while chewing rule. Though their job was to fill the hall with words, they too observed the quiet pauses between courses. In fact, good Scald knew when to speak, almost more than what to say. They waited for the bowls to be wiped, okay, for the ale to be topped off, for the host to lean back and nod. Only then would the tale begin, because if a Scald launched into verse while others were chewing, their words were wasted, half-heard, forgotten. Worse still, the tale might be seen as impolite, as though the Scald valued his voice more than the food on the table. And so, even the most revered speakers of the Norse world held their tongues during bites. It wasn't submission, it was strategy. The speaking order of the benchins, some households, especially during larger feasts, there were set speaking orders, particularly when guests were present. A head of household might say, at the start of the meal, let the fire speak first, then the food, then the men, which meant silence until the wood settled, then the eating, in quiet, and only after that, when bowls were partly empty, did anyone raise their voice. And even then, it was usually the most senior guest who was allowed to speak first, breaking this order by talking mid-chew, or interrupting the quiet of the fire's hiss, was a kind of small rebellion, a social faux pas, not a crime, but not forgotten, because in the Norse longhouse, your place at the bench was constantly negotiated, not just by your actions in war or trade, but by your actions in silence. Communal chewing in synchrony, there is something oddly hypnotic about. Many people chewing together. Modern researchers studying rhythmic group behavior have found that shared tasks like chewing, rowing, or chanting can lead to a feeling of synchrony, and it seems the Vikings understood this instinctively. When everyone in the longhouse chewed quietly at the same time, a kind of group rhythm emerged. The fire's soft crackle, the scrape of spoon on bowl, the occasional rustle of a tunic as someone shifted on the bench. Together, we created a kind of mealtime meditation. Speaking during this rhythm, especially mid-chew, broke the spell, not unlike coughing during a eulogy or laughing during a blessing. It wasn't about the sound, it was about the fracture. And so, once again, mouths stayed closed, not out of fear, but out of reverence for the rhythm. The rare exceptions were their exceptions. Yes, when someone choked, of course, or when an urgent message arrived, or, in the case of extreme cold, when someone needed to warn of smoke or frost in the longhouse. But even then, the speaker tried to swallow first, because the habit was that strong. It wasn't a law. It wasn't enforced. It was cultural gravity, a pull towards silence during food, a gravity shaped not by shame, but by shared history, by the weight of generations that I had eaten before. And so the meal went on, one bite at a time, bread passed from hand to hand, mead poured carefully, a nod here, a glance there, and always tease, the space between mouthful and speech, between chewing and comment, between food and voice, a space that held the weight of 1,000 years of longhouses. And you find yourself wondering, in a world that now talks so much, so fast, so loud, what would it feel like to eat like that, in silence, in rhythm, with respect. So, now we sit at the far end of the meal. The stew pots are nearly empty. The last of the flatbreads are folded on a cloth. The fire's light flickers low across the wide bones of the longhouse. And you've learned, perhaps for the first time in your life, God, that silence doesn't just live between sentences, it lives within the meal itself. And in the longhouse, silence was sacred. But what happened next? What happened after the chewing stopped, after the bowls were stacked and the night set in? The answer is as mundane as it is meaningful. Conversation began, but only then, only after the food had passed through the mouth without interruption, only after every tongue had been respectfully still, and when it was finally time to speak, that speech carried a different weight. The talking fire in many Viking homes. The end of dinner was marked not by a bell or a formal gesture, but by a soft announcements, sometimes a simple phrase like, "The fire is ready to listen," or "Let the fire take the words." These weren't poetic metaphors. They were practical indicators, once spoken. These lines told the house that the food was done. And now the stories could rise. Everyone understood that what came next was not casual. The mouth had fulfilled its duty in eating. Now it was free to speak, but the bar for that speech was high. You weren't to talk about nonsense or complain about the meal. The silence had lifted, but it had disciplined you. And so most people began slowly. They asked after the day's weaving. They told quiet tales of fishing mishaps. If a skald was present, they might offer a half-finished verse and ask for advice. And only much later, once the fire burned low and the guests had found comfort in the quiet rhythm of post-meal thought, did anyone dare raise a weightier subject, a land dispute, a brewing tension with the neighboring village. It's an uneasy dream someone had seen in the night, because the meal had calibrated everyone's mind. No one would burst in with raw emotion. No, one would speak hastily. The long silence had given everyone time to think, and it made them better at choosing their words. When silence became protection, there's one story from a Norse folktale that has lingered through the centuries, told over and over in coastal regions of Norway where the winters were longest. It's the story of a young man, a distant cousin, who came to stay with his kin during the snow season. He was strong, loud, and proud, and on his first night in the longhouse, he couldn't stop talking. He spoke with stew in his mouth. He interrupted blessings. He commented on the food mid-bite. No one corrected him, but no one spoke to him either. The meal ended. The fire was lit. The elder looked to the cousin and said nothing. The next night, the same thing. The cousin grew quiet by the third evening. He had stopped talking while chewing. He waited, like the others, in rhythmic silence. Then, finally, the elder turned to him and offered a story about wolves who wait to howl until the snow muffles their steps. A story that had nothing to do with food, or did it? Because after that, the young man learned. He learned that the silence had protected him. It had given him room to observe, to see, to belong, without harsh words, without shame, just by not responding. That's how the longhouse taught, through stillness, when chewing was political in large gatherings. At seasonal feasts or assemblies, like the Icelandic offing meals, were often where tensions simmered quietly, and the silence during chewing became a kind of political gauge. If someone chewed loudly, it could be interpreted as disrespect. If they spoke during a bite, it could be taken as disregard for their host's honor. A chieftain might notice that a rival's men spoke too soon in a meal. He'd remember it, and when it came time to speak on matters of trade, borders, or alliances, those small breaches of etiquette shaped his decisions. He'd seen the household. He'd tasted the quiet, and he'd noted who respected it and who didn't. So yes, speaking while chewing could actually affect land, marriages, and trade routes, because in a society where words were scarce and measured, when and how you used them mattered more than what they said. Breaking the rule with permission, of course. Rules are only meaningful when they're sometimes broken, but only by those with the right. There were two exceptions to the no talking while chewing custom. Elders, a matriarch, or patriarch, could occasionally mutter something through a mouthful, usually humorous, often ironic, and it was received as wisdom, not error, because their authority transcended etiquette. Drunken warriors. During feasts after battle, when mead had loosened the tongue and laughter filled the hall, the rule softened. But even then, the host might gently raise his hand and say, "The food still speaks. Let it finish," which meant quiet, even now, even here. And most would obey, because even in celebration, the longhouse remembered. It remembered the winters, the funerals, the famines, and in those moments, chewing in silence wasn't about etiquette. It was about dignity, about staying human in the face of hardships. Silence. Cross cultures. This custom wasn't uniquely Norse. In Japan, silence during meals became a mark of mindfulness. In the Islamic world, Prophet Muhammad emphasized eating with humility and avoiding excessive speech at the table. In monastic Europe, meals were often taken in total silence, broken only by the clink of bowls and a single reader reciting scripture. So it seems the Vikings weren't alone. Across cultures, chewing without speaking has been a sign of respect, patience, and discipline. Not because people didn't have thoughts during meals, but because they believed the meal deserved to be experienced and shared in quiet. The vanishing pause in today's world. The rule is mostly gone. We eat with podcasts playing, conversations buzzing, notifications pinging, and somewhere in that noise, the ancient rhythm of chew, pod, swallow, breathe has been lost. But if you listen closely, when you eat alone, when you sit across from someone in trust, when you taste something carefully prepared, that old rhythm might return. You might pause, chew fully, say nothing, let the silence do the work. And in that quiet, very old law might resurface. Not a law written down, but a law felt. The law of those who once knew century after century that eating was not just survival, it was ritual, and silence was the most important ingredient.